Was I wrong for what I did? Honestly, I've replayed it 1,000 times in my head, picking apart every single decision, every word, every single moment leading up to the absolute implosion of my family. I found out they had a group chat, a secret little digital circle, where they were all planning to cut me out of Grandma's will, my own family. The people I'd loved and trusted my entire life were conspiring against me. Tell me truly, if you would have done the same thing, because I'm still reeling, and the silence from them is deafening, a testament to the scorched earth I left behind. It all started, I suppose, with Grandma Rose. She was the matriarch, the glue, the beating heart of our sprawling, complicated family. She was also, bless her generous soul, quite wealthy. My grandfather, a shrewd businessman, had left her a substantial estate, and she had always been very open about her will. From as far back as I can remember, she'd talked about dividing her assets equally among her 3 children, my dad, my Aunt Carol, and my Uncle Mark, and then, importantly, their children, which included me, my cousin Emily, Aunt Carol's daughter, and my cousin David, Uncle Mark's son. We were always told we were all equally loved, equally important, and would be equally provided for. This was the gospel according to Grandma Rose, and we all believed it implicitly. My relationship with my grandma was special. I was the eldest grandchild, and we shared a bond that felt almost spiritual. We'd spend hours in her garden, me helping her plant roses and pull weeds, listening to her stories about her own childhood, her courtship with my grandfather, and the early struggles and triumphs of their life together. She taught me to bake her famous apple pie, a recipe passed down through generations, and we'd laugh until our sides hurt over burnt crusts and spilled flour. When I went to college, she'd send me care packages filled with homemade cookies and handwritten letters, always ending with, "My dearest, my name. Never forget how much you are loved." It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional inheritance, the feeling of being cherished, that truly mattered. My parents, bless their hearts, were always a bit more financially conservative, let's say. They weren't struggling, but they certainly weren't in the same league as Grandma. They always had a quiet reverence for Grandma's wealth, and I'd occasionally catch snippets of conversations about securing our future or making sure everyone is taken care of. It always sounded benign, just responsible adult talk. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Mark were similar. Emily and David, my cousins, were also fairly well off. Emily was a successful lawyer, always impeccably dressed, with a perfectly curated Instagram feed, showcasing her lavish vacations and designer handbags. David, on the other hand, was an entrepreneur, constantly launching new ventures, some successful, some less so, but always with that confident, almost arrogant air of someone who believed they were destined for greatness. We were a close family, or so I thought. Holidays were always a big affair at Grandma's house, filled with laughter, good food, and the occasional spirited debate about politics or sports. We'd exchange gifts, share stories, and generally present a united front to the world. There were no obvious cracks in the facade, no blatant animosity, nothing that would suggest the insidious betrayal that was brewing beneath the surface. The first hint, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor, came a few months ago, when Grandma's health started to decline. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a slow, gentle fading. She was 92, and her body was simply starting to give out. Doctor's appointments became more frequent, and her once vibrant energy began to wane. It was heartbreaking to watch, and I tried to visit her as often as I could, bringing her flowers from her own garden, reading to her, or simply holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. It was during this time that I noticed a shift in my family's dynamics. My parents, aunt and uncle, started having more hushed conversations, often retreating to the kitchen or the study, their voices lowered, their expressions serious. Emily and David also seemed to be in on it, exchanging knowing glances or brief coded remarks. I'd try to join in, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything I could do to help, but I was always met with vague assurances that everything is fine, dear, or just adult talk, sweetie. It felt like a subtle exclusion, like I was suddenly on the outside of an invisible circle. I dismissed it at first. Grief, I reasoned, can make people behave strangely. Maybe they were just worried about Grandma, and I was reading too much into it. But the feeling of being an outsider persisted, a tiny persistent itch under my skin. Then came the infamous family dinner. Grandma had a brief resurgence of energy, and we decided to have a celebratory meal at her house. The air was thick with a forced cheerfulness, a little too loud, a little too bright. Everyone was talking over each other, trying to prove how much they loved Grandma, how much they were doing for her. I noticed my Aunt Carol, subtly trying to steer the conversation towards Grandma's financial affairs, asking innocuous questions about her investments and her future plans. Grandma, sharp as ever despite her age, simply smiled and said, "Everything's in order, darling. My lawyer has everything handled." A few days after that dinner, I went to visit Grandma alone, just us, like the old days. As I was leaving, I realized I'd left my favorite scarf on her armchair. I went back to retrieve it, and as I walked past the living room, I heard voices. My dad, Aunt Carol, Uncle Mark, Emily and David were all gathered around the coffee table, their heads bent together, their faces grim. My heart pounded. I paused, hidden just around the corner, and listened. My dad was saying, "She's just not as responsible as the rest of us. She'll just squander it." Aunt Carol chimed in, "Exactly. Emily and David have established careers, stable lives. They know how to manage money." Uncle Mark added, "And honestly, she hasn't contributed much to the family in recent years. We've all been taking care of Grandma, doing the heavy lifting." My stomach lurched. They were talking about me. There was no doubt. The she they referred to was me, the one who would squander it, the one who hadn't contributed much. I stood there, frozen, the blood draining from my face, a cold dread creeping into my bones. I didn't hear the full context, but the implication was clear. They were trying to cut me out of Grandma's will. I crept away, my scarf forgotten, my mind racing. How could they? How could my own family, the people I trusted, be plotting something so cruel, so unfair? That night, I couldn't sleep. The words echoed in my head, a relentless, torturous loop. Squander it. Hasn't contributed much. The injustice of it all burned like a brand. I'd always been there for Grandma, emotionally, if not always physically. I lived a bit further away than my cousins, but I made every effort to visit, to call, to show her how much I loved her. I wasn't a high-powered lawyer or a budding entrepreneur, but I was a good person, a loving granddaughter, and I certainly wasn't a spendthrift. I worked hard, paid my bills, and lived within my means. The next few weeks were a blur of internal turmoil. I tried to act normal, but every smile from my family felt like a sneer. Every hug felt like a chokehold. I started noticing things, little clues I'd previously overlooked. My dad would avoid my gaze when I mentioned Grandma's will. Emily would make pointed remarks about financial responsibility. David would puff out his chest a little more whenever he talked about his latest business venture. It was like living in a psychological thriller, where everyone around me was an actor in a play I hadn't been cast in. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was at my parents' house. My dad had left his tablet on the kitchen counter, and a notification popped up. It was a message from Aunt Carol. "Did you talk to the lawyer about my name share yet? We need to finalize this before Grandma goes." My heart stopped. It was a group chat notification, a group chat that I was clearly not a part of. My hands trembled as I instinctively picked up the tablet. I knew it was wrong. a violation of privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers, almost independently, tapped on the message, and there it was. The entire sordid history of their betrayal, laid bare before my eyes. The group chat was called Family Matters, and it had been active for months. Hundreds of messages, all discussing me, all planning how to systematically exclude me from Grandma's inheritance. They talked about my supposed irresponsibility, my lack of ambition, my tendency to be flaky. They twisted every innocent mistake I'd ever made, every moment of vulnerability, into evidence of my unworthiness. They discussed strategies, legal loopholes, and even fabricated scenarios to present to Grandma's lawyer. My dad had written, "She's always been a dreamer, not a doer. The money would just disappear." Aunt Carol had chimed in, "Emily and David are the ones truly dedicated to the family legacy." Even Emily and David, my cousins, whom I'd shared childhood secrets and laughter with, had participated, agreeing with their parents, adding their own petty grievances and justifications. The pain was excruciating. It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal, the deep fundamental breach of trust. My own family, my blood, had been secretly conspiring against me, painting me as a worthless parasite, unworthy of my grandmother's love or generosity. I saw screenshots of emails they'd sent to Grandma's lawyer, outlining their arguments, presenting a distorted picture of my character and my life. They had even managed to convince the lawyer, or at least they were trying to, that I was somehow a bad influence on Grandma, subtly isolating her from me. The final message I saw was from Aunt Carol, sent just hours before. "It's all in place. The lawyer has agreed to meet with Grandma next week to make the amendments. My name won't see a dime." One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was at my parents' house. My dad had left his tablet on the kitchen counter, and a notification popped up. It was a message from Aunt Carol. "Did you talk to the lawyer about my name share yet? We need to finalize this before Grandma goes." My heart stopped. It was a group chat notification, a group chat that I was clearly not a part of. My hands trembled as I instinctively picked up the tablet. I knew it was wrong, a violation of privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers, almost independently, tapped on the message, and there it was. The entire sordid history of their betrayal, laid bare before my eyes. The group chat was called Family Matters, and it had been active for months. Hundreds of messages, all discussing me, all planning how to systematically exclude me from Grandma's inheritance. They talked about my supposed irresponsibility, my lack of ambition, my tendency to be flaky. They twisted every innocent mistake I'd ever made, every moment of vulnerability, into evidence of my unworthiness. They discussed strategies, legal loopholes, and even fabricated scenarios to present to Grandma's lawyer. My dad had written, "She's always been a dreamer, not a doer. The money would just disappear." Aunt Carol had chimed in, "Emily and David are the ones truly dedicated to the family legacy." Even Emily and David, my cousins, whom I'd shared childhood secrets and laughter with, had participated, agreeing with their parents, adding their own petty grievances and justifications. The pain was excruciating. It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal, the deep fundamental breach of trust. My own family, my blood, had been secretly conspiring against me, painting me as a worthless parasite, unworthy of my grandmother's love or generosity. I saw screenshots of emails they'd sent to Grandma's lawyer, outlining their arguments, presenting a distorted picture of my character and my life. They had even managed to convince the lawyer, or at least they were trying to, that I was somehow a bad influence on Grandma, subtly isolating her from me. The final message I saw was from Aunt Carol, sent just hours before. "It's all in place. The lawyer has agreed to meet with Grandma next week to make the amendments." My name won't see a dime. Very concerned about making sure everything is fair. My heart sank, but I pushed on. Fair, Grandma? What do you mean? She hesitated, then sighed. They seem to think, my dear, that you might not be, shall we say, as financially savvy as your cousins. They suggested it might be best to reallocate some of the inheritance, so it's handled more responsibly. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just been talking about it. They had actively tried to poison Grandma's mind against me. The audacity, the sheer cruelty of it took my breath away. Grandma, I said, my voice trembling slightly, do you truly believe that? Do you think I would squander your legacy? Do you think I'm irresponsible? She looked at me, really looked at me, with those kind, wise eyes that had seen so much, and then a flicker of doubt, a shadow of confusion crossed her face. Well, darling, they made some very compelling arguments. They said you'd been struggling, that you weren't as stable as Emily and David. They even showed me some reports. My mind raced. Reports? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What reports, Grandma? It turned out they had fabricated documents, doctored bank statements, and exaggerated stories about my financial struggles, presenting them to Grandma as evidence. My own family had created a web of lies to discredit me, to paint me as unworthy. That was the final straw. I took a deep breath, and with as much composure as I could muster, I told Grandma everything. I told her about the group chat, about their months of planning, about the fabricated reports, about their intention to cut me out completely. I showed her the messages on my phone, scrolling through the vile words, the callous disregard for her wishes and my feelings. Grandma sat there, silent, her face paling with each revelation. Her hands, once busy with pie dough, lay still in her lap. When I finished, the kitchen was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, she slowly, deliberately, picked up the rolling pin. My dear, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Thank you for telling me. The aftermath was, as you can imagine, an unholy mess. Grandma, with a fury I hadn't seen in years, called her lawyer. She didn't just reverse the proposed changes. She rewrote her will entirely. My dad, Aunt Carol, Uncle Mark, Emily and David were all explicitly disinherited, not just from their share of the money, but from any mention in her will at all. Instead, she left everything to a trust, managed by an independent executor, with strict instructions that the funds be used for charitable causes close to her heart, and a small but significant portion explicitly left to me as a gesture of her unwavering love and trust. She also made it clear that her decision was due to the profound betrayal and deceit exhibited by certain family members. The lawyer, a stern man who had known Grandma for decades, ensured that every detail was ironed out, every legal loophole closed. Then came the confrontation. Grandma, with a renewed strength that surprised us all, called a family meeting. She sat at the head of the dining table, regal and unyielding, while the rest of them squirmed in their seats, sensing the impending storm. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply, calmly, laid out their betrayal, piece by piece, revealing the group chat messages, the fabricated reports, the extent of their calculated cruelty. Their faces, one by one, crumpled in disbelief, then horror, then a desperate, pathetic scramble for excuses. My dad tried to deny it, then to minimize it. Aunt Carol burst into tears, claiming she was just, looking out for Grandma's best interests. Uncle Mark tried to shift the blame to my dad. Emily and David, usually so composed, were reduced to stammering, guilt-ridden adolescents. Grandma cut them off, her voice like ice. I loved you all, she said, her eyes welling up. But you chose greed over family, deceit over honesty. You tried to steal from your own, and worse, you tried to manipulate an old woman. For that, there is no forgiveness. The silence that followed was deafening. My family, or what was left of it, dispersed like scattering roaches. There were calls, angry voicemails, desperate pleas for forgiveness, but Grandma held firm. And so did I. I never spoke to them again. Grandma lived for another year after that, a year of peace and quiet, surrounded by the genuine love of a few loyal friends and me. We spent our time together, baking, gardening, talking, and she often told me how grateful she was, not just for saving her from their manipulation, but for showing her the truth of who they really were. When she passed away, peacefully in her sleep, I was the only family member at her funeral. The charitable organizations she chose have received their endowments, and a portion of her estate, as she promised, came to me. It wasn't about the money in the end. It was about justice, about standing up for myself, and about honoring Grandma's trust. The pain of losing my family is immense, a wound that may never fully heal. But the peace of knowing I did the right thing, that I protected Grandma's wishes and her legacy, is a comfort I wouldn't trade for anything. So, that's my story. A story of betrayal, of revelation, and of a choice that irrevocably altered the course of my life. Was I wrong for what I did? I still grapple with that question sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night. But then I remember the group chat, the lies, the manipulation, and I know deep in my heart that I had no other choice. Like this video, if you were on my side, if you think I made the right decision in exposing their deceit, subscribe for more stories like this, where I share the raw, unfiltered truth of human nature. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. I truly want to hear what you think. I'll see you all in the next story.